Leah stood at the window of their modest apartment, watching the bustling streets of Sao Paulo below. The city was alive with activity, but inside her, everything felt heavy, stagnant. She could hear Pedro in the next room, typing furiously on his laptop. His focus was so intense that it was as if she didn't exist. Their conversations had dwindled to short exchanges about household logistics. Who would buy groceries or take out the trash? The distance between them wasn't just emotional, it felt physical. Pedro seemed to be a stranger now, and Leah couldn't pinpoint when exactly things had begun to unravel. When had their laughter turned to silence, their shared dreams become so divergent? She missed the days when they had talked about everything, his tech career, her passion for teaching, their plans for the future. Now, there was a void, and it terrified her. Pedro had been working late more often, attending networking events with people Leah didn't know. She noticed how he no longer invited her to these gatherings. The first time it happened, she thought it was just a one-off, but over the months, it became clear. Pedro didn't want her there. He was embarrassed, or worse, indifferent. Leah sat down on the couch, staring at the wedding photo on the wall. They had been so young, so hopeful. She remembered the vows they had made, promises to always support each other, to grow together, but lately, all they did was drift apart. Her heart clenched as she realized how far they had both come from those idealistic beginnings. Pedro's success in the tech world had skyrocketed in the last few years. He had gone from working long hours at a small startup to managing a rapidly growing company. His rise had been meteoric, but as his career took off, so did his distance from Leah. She had supported him through everything, even when it meant sacrificing her own dreams. But now, she wondered if Pedro even noticed her sacrifices, or if he even cared. She had tried talking to him, but every time she brought up her feelings, Pedro brushed them off, claiming he was too busy or that she was overreacting. The excuses were always the same. Work was stressful, the timing wasn't right. Leah had begun to feel like she was a burden, something that Pedro had to manage rather than cherish. Tears welled up in her eyes as she fought the rising tide of frustration and sadness. How had things come to this? She had always imagined that they would grow stronger through challenges, but instead, it felt like each obstacle had chipped away at their bond. Leah wondered if Pedro even loved her anymore, or if she had become just another part of his life that didn't fit with his new reality. The sound of Pedro's phone ringing pulled her from her thoughts. He answered quickly, his tone sharp and professional. Another work call. Leah knew that he wouldn't emerge from his office for hours. She felt invisible, as though her presence in the apartment no longer mattered, and maybe it didn't. A painful thought crossed her mind. Perhaps Pedro wasn't ashamed of her job as a teacher, or her simple, grounded nature. Perhaps he was ashamed of the version of her that still believed in them, something he had clearly left behind long ago. The next morning, Leah woke up early, her thoughts still lingering on the pain she felt the night before. She knew that if she didn't confront Pedro soon, this silence between them would only grow deeper, solidifying the emotional wall that had already been built. She couldn't continue pretending that everything was fine. Today would be the day she addressed it. She had to. As Pedro sat at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee and scrolling through emails, Leah took a deep breath. Her heart pounded in her chest as she walked over and sat across from him, determined to have the conversation she had been avoiding for too long. Pedro, we need to talk, Leah said, her voice firmer than she expected. Pedro looked up, his brow furrowing slightly. About what? I have a meeting soon, Leah. She could feel the tension already rising. He always had a meeting, an excuse to avoid anything deeper than surface-level conversation, but this time, she wasn't going to let him brush her off. It's about us, she replied, keeping her tone steady despite the lump forming in her throat. Pedro sighed, setting his coffee cup down. What's there to talk about? Everything is fine, Leah. I'm just busy with work. You know how demanding things are right now. Leah's frustration bubbled to the surface. That's the problem, Pedro. You're always busy, always preoccupied with work, and we never talk anymore. I feel like I'm invisible to you, like I don't matter. Pedro's eyes flickered with annoyance. That's not fair, Leah. You know how important my job is. I'm doing this for us, for our future, for us. Leah repeated, her voice rising slightly. It doesn't feel like it's for us. It feels like it's for you. I've been supportive, I've been patient, but I can't keep pretending that everything is okay when it's not. Pedro leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. What do you want me to do, Leah? Quit my job? We need this. Especially if we want a better life. A better life? Leah asked, incredulous. What's the point of a better life if we're not even in it together? You don't see me anymore, Pedro. You barely talk to me. You don't even want me to come to your work events. Do you even realize how that makes me feel? Pedro's expression shifted slightly, but he remained defensive. Those events are business, they're not personal, you wouldn't enjoy them anyway. It's not about whether I'd enjoy them, Leah said, her voice softening but filled with hurt. It's about how you make me feel when you leave me out, when you act like I'm not part of your life anymore. Pedro stared at her for a long moment, and for the first time, Leah saw a flicker of something. Guilt, perhaps, but just as quickly, it vanished, replaced by the same cold indifference that had become so familiar. I'm not trying to leave you out, Leah, he said, his tone softer now but still distant. I'm just focused on my career right now. Things will get better once everything settles down. But Leah knew better. She had heard those words too many times before. I don't think it's just about your career, Pedro, she said quietly. I think you've changed, and I don't know if I fit into the life you're building anymore. The silence that followed was deafening. Pedro didn't deny it. He didn't reassure her or try to fix things. He just sat there, staring down at the table as if he didn't have an answer. Leah felt her heart sink. This was the moment she had been dreading. The moment she realized that Pedro might not be willing to fight for their marriage, and maybe, just maybe, he didn't want to. With tears brimming in her eyes, she stood up from the table. I can't keep living like this, Pedro. I need more than this. Pedro didn't stop her as she walked out of the kitchen and into the bedroom, her chest tight with a mix of sorrow and resolve. She had said what she needed to say. Now, it was up to Pedro to decide if he was willing to meet her halfway, or if this was the beginning of the end. Leah spent the rest of the day in a state of emotional numbness. After their conversation that morning, she had hoped for some kind of resolution, a sign that Pedro was willing to fight for them, but no such moment came. Instead, he left for his meetings as usual, leaving behind an oppressive silence that seemed to fill the entire apartment. She tried to distract herself by cleaning, organizing things around the house, anything to keep her mind busy, but no matter how hard she tried, the thoughts kept circling back to the same place. Their marriage was unraveling, and she didn't know how to stop it. Was this what life would be like from now on? Always waiting, hoping for change that never came? That evening, Pedro returned home late, as he often did. Leah sat on the couch, her eyes fixed on the TV but not really watching. She heard the door open and close, the rustle of Pedro setting down his briefcase, but she didn't look up. The weight of their earlier conversation still hung between them, heavy and unresolved. Pedro walked into the living room, his movements cautious. Hey, he said, his voice soft, almost unsure. You okay? Leah turned to him, her heart aching. There was a time when just hearing his voice was enough to make her smile, to feel safe and loved. Now, it only reminded her of the distance between them. I'm fine, she replied, though the truth was far from it. Pedro sat down on the chair opposite her, rubbing his temples. Look, about this morning, I'm sorry if I made you feel like I'm not here for you. There's a lot on my plate right now. Leah nodded, her eyes filling with unshed tears. She had heard his apologies before, but they always felt hollow, like he was saying the words because he knew he should, not because he truly meant them. I understand that you're busy, Pedro, but being busy doesn't mean you can forget about us. He looked at her, the guilt flickering across his face for a brief moment before he masked it with frustration. I'm not forgetting about us, Leah. I'm trying to build something for our future. Why can't you see that? The tears finally spilled over as Leah shook her head. Because it feels like you're building a future without me in it. Pedro opened his mouth to respond but then closed it again, as if he didn't know what to say. The silence between them was unbearable, and Leah felt her heart breaking a little more with each passing second. I just need some time, he finally muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Leah stood up, unable to sit there any longer. Time for what, Pedro? Time to figure out if you still want me in your life? I can't keep waiting for you to decide if I'm enough for you. I deserve more than that. Pedro didn't respond. He just sat there, staring at the floor, his expression unreadable. Leah's heart shattered. She had always believed that love could overcome anything, but now, it seemed like love wasn't enough. Not when the person you loved was no longer willing to fight for you. She turned and walked into the bedroom, closing the door softly behind her. The tears came in earnest then, her body shaking with the force of her sobs. She had never felt so alone, not even when she first moved to Sao Paulo and knew no one but Pedro, at least back then. She had hope. Now, all she had was the crushing realization that her marriage was falling apart, and there was nothing she could do to save it on her own. The next morning, Leah woke up with swollen eyes and a heavy heart. Pedro had already left for work by the time she got up, and the apartment felt eerily quiet. She wandered into the kitchen and saw a note on the counter. We'll talk more tonight. I'm sorry. It was the same apology she had seen too many times, written in different words but carrying the same emptiness. She crumpled the note in her hand and tossed it in the trash. the action a small but significant release of the frustration that had been building inside her. Leah knew she couldn't keep living like this. She couldn't keep waiting for Pedro to decide if he wanted to be part of her life. For the first time, she realized that maybe she had to stop waiting for him to change and start thinking about what she wanted, what she needed to feel whole again. She picked up her phone and dialed Camilla's number, her best friend who had always been there for her, no matter what. "Can we meet up later?" Leah asked when Camilla answered. "I need to talk, of course," Camilla replied, her voice full of concern. "I'll meet you at our usual cafe." Leah hung up, feeling a small sense of relief. Talking to Camilla wouldn't fix everything, but it was a start. For once, Leah was putting herself first, and though the path ahead was uncertain, she knew she couldn't continue down the road she was on. Something had to change. Later that afternoon, Leah sat at her favorite corner table in the cafe, waiting for Camilla. The familiar smell of coffee and the warm hum of conversation around her should have been comforting, but today, it wasn't enough to quiet the turmoil inside her. Her thoughts were racing, and every time she closed her eyes, all she could see was Pedro's distant expression from the night before. Camilla arrived a few minutes later, her face full of concern as she approached. She hugged Leah tightly before sitting down, her eyes searching her friend's face for answers. "What's going on, Leah?" Camilla asked, her voice gentle but urgent. "You sounded upset on the phone." Leah took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She wasn't sure where to begin. "It's Pedro," she said quietly. "I don't think things are going to work out between us anymore." Camilla's brow furrowed as she leaned forward, resting her arms on the table. "What happened?" "I thought you two were okay, just busy with work and everything." Leah shook her head, tears threatening to fall again. "We're not okay. We haven't been for a long time. He's so focused on his career, on building this perfect life for himself, that I feel like I've disappeared. He doesn't see me anymore. Camilla, I'm just there, like an afterthought." Camilla reached across the table and took Leah's hand, squeezing it tightly. "I'm so sorry, Leah. I had no idea it had gotten this bad." Leah bit her lip, trying to hold back the flood of emotions that had been building for so long. "I've tried to talk to him, to make him see how I feel, but it's like he's already made up his mind. He's changed so much, and I don't think I fit into his life anymore." "Maybe I never did." Camilla's eyes widened in surprise. "Don't say that. You've been with him through everything. You've always supported him. If he can't see how amazing you are, that's his problem, not yours." Leah smiled weakly, appreciating her friend's loyalty, but deep down, she knew the truth. "It's not that simple. I think Pedro is ashamed of me. He doesn't want me around his work friends, and he never introduces me as his wife anymore. It's like I'm not good enough for the life he's building." Camilla frowned, her expression hardening. "That's ridiculous. You've done nothing but love and support him. If he can't see that, then he's the one who's not good enough for you." Leah looked down at her coffee, her heart heavy. "I don't know what to do, Camilla. I don't want to give up on our marriage, but I can't keep living like this, feeling like I'm invisible." Camilla leaned closer, her voice firm but kind. "Leah, you deserve to be with someone who values you, who's proud to have you in their life. You can't keep sacrificing yourself for someone who doesn't appreciate you. You've lost yourself in this relationship, and that's not fair to you." Leah wiped away a stray tear, nodding slowly. "I know you're right. I don't know how to move forward from here. It's scary to think about being on my own." Camilla gave her a soft, encouraging smile. "It is scary, but you're stronger than you think. You've already taken the hardest step by admitting that something needs to change. Now, you just need to decide what's best for you. Don't let Pedro's neglect make you forget your worth." For the first time in a long time, Leah felt a flicker of hope. Camilla's words reminded her of the person she used to be. The confident, passionate woman who had dreams of her own, who had never been afraid to stand up for herself. Somewhere along the way, she had lost sight of that. But maybe it wasn't too late to find it again. "I don't know what the future holds," Leah admitted, her voice shaky but resolute. "But I know I can't keep waiting for Pedro to change. I need to figure out what I want, what makes me happy." Camilla nodded, her eyes full of support. "And I'll be here every step of the way, no matter what you decide." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation hanging between them. But this time, the silence didn't feel as heavy. Leah felt a sense of clarity starting to form. A realization that, while the road ahead might be difficult, she wasn't walking it alone. As they left the cafe, Leah felt lighter. She still didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was starting to regain control of her life. The conversation with Camilla had reminded her of something important. She didn't need Pedro's validation to be whole. She had the strength to stand on her own. And now, it was time to find out what that looked like. The next few days passed in a blur of introspection for Leah. After her conversation with Camilla, something had shifted within her. She could feel it, the slow but steady rise of her own strength, a voice inside that she had silenced for far too long. She wasn't sure where this journey would lead, but she knew that, for the first time in years, she needed to put herself first. Leah spent her mornings at school, pouring her energy into her students. Teaching had always been her passion, and now it became her refuge. The classroom was a place where she felt purposeful, where her presence mattered. Her students were oblivious to the storm brewing in her personal life, and in a way, that was a relief. Here, in this space, she wasn't defined by her relationship with Pedro. She was simply Miss Leah, a teacher who cared deeply about the young minds in her charge. But even in the midst of her work, thoughts of Pedro lingered. The nights were the hardest. He would come home late, exhausted, barely acknowledging her before retreating to his office or going straight to bed. They were living parallel lives, their paths no longer intersecting in any meaningful way. The silence between them was deafening, yet neither seemed willing to confront it again after their last conversation. One night, Leah found herself sitting on the balcony of their apartment, looking out at the city lights. The noise of Sao Paulo drifted up from the streets below, a constant reminder of the life teeming all around her, but inside, she felt disconnected from it all, trapped in the quiet isolation of her thoughts. She had been staring at her phone for what felt like hours, scrolling through photos of her life before things had gone so wrong, pictures of her and Pedro from happier times, when they were younger, full of dreams and hope. Back then, their love had felt unshakable. They had faced challenges before, but they had always believed they could get through anything together. Now, looking at those images, Leah couldn't help but wonder, had that love been real, or had it been an illusion all along? Her finger hovered over Pedro's contact name on her phone. She could call him, try to have another conversation, try to fix things, but deep down, she knew that it wasn't just a matter of talking anymore. Something fundamental had changed between them, and no amount of words could bring back what they had lost. The next day, as Leah stood in front of her class, something clicked. She had been teaching a lesson on history, discussing how societies evolve over time, how they grow, change, and sometimes fall apart. The parallels to her own life were too clear to ignore. Relationships, like societies, either adapted or crumbled under the weight of neglect and misunderstanding. After class, Leah stayed behind to grade papers, but her mind wasn't on the work. Instead, she found herself thinking about her own evolution, who she had been before Pedro, and who she had become now. She used to be so confident, so sure of what she wanted in life, but somewhere along the way, she had let Pedro's dreams overshadow her own. She had let his success, his ambitions, dictate the rhythm of their lives. That evening, after Pedro had gone to bed, Leah sat down at her computer. She hadn't done this in a long time. Looked at opportunities for herself. She opened up a search engine and typed in master's programs in education. It was something she had always dreamed of pursuing, but the timing had never felt right. There had always been something, Pedro's job, his career demands, their financial situation, that took precedence over her own desires. But now, as she scrolled through the different programs, Leah realized something. The timing would never be perfect. She couldn't keep waiting for everything to fall into place, for Pedro to suddenly become the supportive partner she needed. If she wanted to grow, if she wanted to reclaim her identity, she had to take that step for herself, regardless of whether Pedro was ready to support her or not. A sense of empowerment surged through her as she clicked on different schools, reading about their programs, imagining herself in a classroom again. But this time as a student, she could feel the excitement building inside her, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. It was the feeling of hope, of possibility, of a future that wasn't tied to someone else's expectations. The next morning, she made a decision. After getting ready for work, Leah walked into the kitchen where Pedro was finishing his coffee, getting ready to leave for another long day at the office. He glanced at her, but there was no warmth in his eyes, just the same distant acknowledgement that had become their routine. "I'm going to apply for a master's program," Leah said, her voice steady but firm. She didn't wait for his approval or opinion. She was simply stating a fact. Pedro looked up, surprised. "A master's program? Now?" "Yes, now," Leah replied. "I've been thinking about it for a while, and I need to do this for myself. It's something I've always wanted, and I can't keep putting it off." Pedro didn't say much, just nodded and mumbled something about being supportive, but Leah could tell from his tone that he wasn't really invested in the conversation, and that was okay. For the first time in a long time, she didn't need his validation. This was her decision, her future. As Pedro left for work, Leah felt a quiet sense of victory. It wasn't the end of their marriage, not yet, but it was the beginning of something new, something that belonged to her, and only her. She had spent years sacrificing her own dreams for the sake of their relationship, but now, she was finally reclaiming her own story. As the weeks passed, Leah immersed herself in the process of applying for the master's program. Each step brought her closer to reclaiming the dreams she had put on hold for so long. She spent her evenings researching schools, filling out applications, and writing personal statements. The work was a welcome distraction from the quiet disintegration of her marriage. Pedro's indifference continued, his focus locked on his career. While Leah's attention had shifted toward her own future, they existed together, but barely. One evening, after yet another long day apart, Pedro came home late. Leah was in the kitchen, sorting through the last of her application materials when he walked in. He looked tired, the usual tension in his shoulders as he hung up his coat and set his briefcase down. Leah glanced up but said nothing, the silence between them too familiar to break easily. Pedro grabbed a glass of water and stood at the counter, his eyes scanning the room before finally settling on Leah's stack of papers. "You're really serious about this master's thing, huh?" he asked, his tone flat. Leah nodded, not stopping her work. "I am. I've submitted my applications to a few programs." Pedro was quiet for a moment, then let out a small sigh. "I just don't get why you're doing it now. Things are busy, and this feels like bad timing." Leah felt the sting of his words, but she had expected them. For weeks, Pedro had been subtly questioning her decision, as if her desire for something more was an inconvenience to his life. "It's never going to be the perfect time, Pedro," she replied calmly, not rising to the bait, "but this is something I need to do for me." Pedro took a sip of water, his expression unreadable. "I'm not saying you shouldn't do it, I just thought we were in this together. This doesn't feel like a decision we made." Leah felt her frustration growing. "That's the point, Pedro, we haven't made decisions together for a long time. You've been making decisions for yourself, about your career, your life, and I've been sitting on the sidelines, waiting for a moment that's never going to come." He frowned, clearly not expecting her response. "That's not fair. I've been working hard for us, for our future." "I know you've been working hard," Leah said, her voice softening, "but somewhere along the way, we lost each other, and I can't keep waiting for things to go back to how they used to be. I need to move forward." Pedro looked at her, his face a mix of confusion and frustration. "So, what are you saying? That you're just going to leave me behind?" Leah paused, choosing her words carefully. "I'm saying that I'm not going to keep waiting for you to change, Pedro. I've spent too long trying to hold us together, but I can't do it by myself anymore. I need to focus on myself now, on what makes me happy." The silence that followed was heavy. Pedro looked down at his glass, his mind clearly racing, but he didn't say anything. Leah waited, hoping he might fight for them, for her, but the words never came. Instead, he nodded, the resignation in his expression unmistakable. "I guess I've been too focused on my work," he said quietly. "I didn't realize how far apart we'd gotten." Leah's heart broke a little more hearing him say it out loud. She had wanted this acknowledgement for so long, but now that it was here, it felt hollow. "It wasn't enough, not anymore. I wanted you to see me, Pedro. I wanted you to care about us, to fight for what we had, but I don't think you're willing to do that." Pedro looked up at her, his eyes filled with something like regret. "I don't know if I can. I've been so focused on building this life, and I thought it was for us, but maybe it was just for me." Leah nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I know, and that's why I need to move on. I can't keep waiting for you to want the same things I do." Pedro set his glass down, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "So, this is it? You're leaving?" Leah hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had imagined this conversation 1,000 times, but now that it was happening, the finality of it was overwhelming. "I don't know yet," she admitted softly, "but I need space. I need time to figure out what I want, without feeling like I'm trapped in a life that isn't mine." Pedro didn't argue, didn't beg her to stay. He simply nodded, the resignation clear in his expression. "I understand," he said quietly. "I don't want to hold you back." The words were meant to be kind, but they only deepened the ache in Leah's heart. She had loved Pedro so deeply, had given so much of herself to their life together, but somewhere along the way, they had become two people moving in opposite directions, and no amount of love could bridge that gap. That night, Leah lay in bed next to Pedro, but sleep didn't come. Her mind raced with thoughts of what the future held, where she would go, what her life would look like without him. The fear of the unknown gripped her, but beneath it was a quiet sense of liberation. For so long, she had been living for someone else, but now, for the first time, she was choosing herself. When morning came, the decision was made. Leah packed a small suitcase, enough for a few days, and left a note on the kitchen table. She needed space, and whether or not this was the end, she wasn't sure. But one thing was clear, she couldn't keep sacrificing her own happiness for the sake of a life that no longer felt like hers. As she walked out the door, Leah felt the weight of years lift from her shoulders. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it was hers to shape. Leah didn't know where she was headed when she walked out of the apartment that morning. The air was cool and crisp, the kind of morning that carried a sense of new beginnings. With her small suitcase in hand, she moved through the bustling streets of Sao Paulo, feeling strangely detached from the noise and chaos around her. Her mind was racing, filled with questions and doubts about the future, but also with a quiet sense of determination. After a few hours, Leah found herself in front of a small hotel she had passed many times before. It was nothing fancy, just a modest place tucked away on a quieter street. She checked in, grateful for the anonymity it offered, and settled into the simple room. As she sat on the edge of the bed, looking out the window, a wave of exhaustion washed over her. The emotional weight of the past few days, the culmination of years of silent suffering, finally caught up to her. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the sadness. She let the tears fall, the grief of a life that was now in the past. It wasn't just the end of her marriage that she mourned, it was the end of a version of herself that had existed only in the context of that relationship. The Leah who had bent over backward to make things work, who had put someone else's dreams above her own, was gone, and with her departure, a new Leah was being born. One who was learning to stand on her own. That night, in the quiet solitude of her hotel room, Leah found a sense of peace. The uncertainty of the future still scared her, but she knew she had made the right decision. She couldn't keep waiting for Pedro to change, or for their marriage to return to what it once was. The love they had shared was real, but it wasn't enough anymore. Not for the life Leah needed to live. The next morning, Leah woke with a renewed sense of purpose. She pulled out her laptop and began going through emails, her mind set on the master's program applications she had sent out. The possibility of returning to school filled her with excitement, something she hadn't felt in a long time. It was a reminder that there was still so much ahead of her, so many dreams to chase, so much life to live. As the days passed, Leah found herself adjusting to her new reality. She kept her distance from Pedro, but they exchanged a few texts, short, polite messages that carried none of the weight their conversations used to. She knew he was struggling too, but Leah didn't reach out to comfort him. She couldn't. This was a time for both of them to figure out who they were apart from each other. One afternoon, while Leah was sitting in a cafe near the hotel, she received an email that made her heart race. It was from one of the master's programs she had applied to, her top choice. With trembling fingers, she opened the message and read the words she had been hoping for. "Congratulations. We are pleased to offer you a place in our program." Leah gasped, her heart soaring with excitement. She had done it. She had taken the first step toward building a future for herself, a future that was entirely her own. The tears that filled her eyes this time weren't of sadness, but of joy. For so long, she had doubted herself, believed that her dreams were secondary to everyone else's, but now, she was proving to herself that she was capable of more than she had ever imagined. Camilla was the first person she called, and her friend's joyful scream on the other end of the line made Leah laugh through her tears. "I knew you could do it," Camilla exclaimed. "This is the start of something amazing. Leah, you deserve this more than anyone." Leah smiled, feeling the warmth of her friend's words wash over her. "Thank you, Camilla. I'm still scared, but I know this is the right path." "Of course you're scared," Camilla said, her voice softening, "but that's because you're stepping into something new, something unknown, and that's exactly where you're supposed to be." Leah hung up the phone feeling lighter than she had in months. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't looking back. She wasn't waiting for Pedro to decide their future or for their marriage to miraculously heal itself. She was moving forward, on her terms. That evening, Leah returned to the hotel and sat down to write in her journal, something she hadn't done in years. The words flowed easily as she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The love, the pain, the decisions that had led her to walk out of that apartment. It wasn't an easy journey, but it was hers, and she was proud of how far she had come. Later, as she lay in bed, Leah thought about what the future might hold. She didn't have all the answers, and that was okay. For now, she was focused on one thing: building a life that felt authentic, a life where she could grow, dream, and be unapologetically herself. And as she drifted off to sleep, a quiet sense of peace settled over her. She had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid to find out. Days turned into weeks, and Leah continued to move forward with her life. She had enrolled in her master's program, preparing for the next phase of her journey. Each day brought new challenges, but also new moments of self-discovery. She found herself rediscovering passions she had long buried, reconnecting with friends, and embracing the independence that had once frightened her. Despite this growth, the issue of her relationship with Pedro still lingered. They hadn't spoken in person since the day she left the apartment. Their few text exchanges had been brief, civil, but emotionally distant. Leah had wanted to give both of them space, but she knew that eventually, they would need to have a final conversation. There were still loose ends to tie up, financial matters, the apartment, and, most importantly, closure. One afternoon, as Leah was organizing her things in the hotel, her phone buzzed with a message from Pedro. "Can we talk?" Leah stared at the screen, her heart sinking. She had known this moment was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. After a long pause, she replied, "Yes, when?" Pedro suggested meeting at a cafe near their old apartment the next day. Leah agreed, feeling a sense of dread and relief all at once. This conversation was inevitable, but it would be hard. Still, she knew it was time. The following day, Leah arrived at the cafe early. She chose a quiet corner table and sat down, her hands trembling slightly. The memories of their life together flooded her mind. Both the good and the bad. They had shared so much, but in the end, it hadn't been enough to keep them together. She wasn't sure what Pedro wanted to say, but she knew that whatever happened today, she needed to stay true to the new path she had chosen for herself. Pedro walked in a few minutes later, his face tense but not angry. He looked exhausted, as if the weight of their separation had finally caught up with him. Leah offered him a small smile as he approached the table, and he nodded in acknowledgement before sitting down. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt heavy, filled with all the things they hadn't said over the past few months. Finally, Pedro broke the silence. "How are you?" he asked, his voice quiet. Leah took a deep breath, surprised by the question. "I'm okay," she replied honestly. "I'm finding my way." Pedro nodded, looking down at his hands. "That's good, I'm glad to hear that." There was another pause, and then Pedro looked up, his eyes meeting Leah's. "I've been thinking a lot about everything, about us. I didn't realize how much I was losing until you walked out that door." Leah felt a pang of sadness but remained calm. "Pedro, I needed to leave. I couldn't keep living like we were, pretending that things would get better if I just waited long enough." "I know," Pedro said, his voice heavy with regret. "I pushed you away. I was so focused on my work, on building this career, that I forgot what really mattered. I took you for granted, and I'm sorry." Leah swallowed the lump in her throat. She had waited so long to hear those words, but now that they were here, they didn't change anything. "I appreciate the apology, Pedro, but it's not just about what you did or didn't do. We've both changed, we grew apart, and I think we both know that." Pedro's eyes filled with emotion. "I don't want to lose you, Leah. I've realized that I was wrong, that I should have made you and our marriage a priority. Can't we try again?" Leah's heart ached hearing the plea in his voice. A part of her wanted to say yes, to go back to the life they had shared, but another part of her, the part that had been fighting for her own identity and happiness, knew that they couldn't go back. Too much had happened, and the person she was now wasn't the same woman who had built her life around Pedro's needs. "I don't think we can, Pedro," Leah said softly but firmly. "I'm not the same person I was before, and I don't think you are either. I've learned so much about myself over these past few months. I need to keep moving forward, and I think you do too." Pedro looked devastated, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped his coffee cup. "But what about everything we've been through? Doesn't that mean anything?" "It does," Leah replied, her voice steady. "We shared a lot of beautiful moments, and I'll always be grateful for that. But sometimes, love isn't enough to make a relationship work. We've grown in different directions, and that's okay." Pedro closed his eyes, exhaling deeply. He knew she was right. There was no anger between them now, just sadness at what they had lost. When he opened his eyes again, there was a quiet acceptance in them. "I understand," he said softly. "I don't want to hold you back. You deserve to be happy, even if it's not with me." Leah reached across the table and gently took his hand. "So do you, Pedro. You deserve to find happiness too." They sat there for a while, holding hands in a gesture of finality, both of them coming to terms with the end of their marriage. It wasn't the dramatic, painful ending Leah had once feared. It was a quiet, mutual understanding that they had given all they could, and now it was time to let go. After a few more moments of silence, Pedro stood up. "I guess this is goodbye," he said, his voice breaking slightly. Leah nodded, standing as well. "Goodbye, Pedro." They shared a long, meaningful hug before parting ways, both of them walking out of the cafe knowing that this chapter of their lives had come to a close. Leah watched him disappear into the crowd, feeling a mixture of relief, sadness, and hope. She had said her final goodbye to the life she had once known, and now, the future was wide open. As she walked back to her hotel, Leah felt the weight of the past lift from her shoulders. There were no regrets, no anger, only the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had made the right decision. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Leah was excited to see where it would lead. In the weeks following her final conversation with Pedro, Leah's life began to settle into a new rhythm. The clarity she had gained from that goodbye, while painful, had opened up space in her heart and mind for new possibilities. She returned to her small hotel room that evening with a sense of closure she hadn't thought possible. It was over, and though it hurt, there was freedom in that ending. Her days quickly became filled with preparations for her upcoming master's program. She received her acceptance letter officially, and soon after, the reality of her new academic journey began to take shape. Leah threw herself into researching course materials, looking at her future class schedule, and beginning to organize her life around this new pursuit of learning. The excitement she felt was electric, the kind of motivation she hadn't felt in years. Yet, in the quiet moments, there were still reflections on her life with Pedro. It was impossible to erase years of love, shared memories, and dreams that had once felt so solid. Leah would find herself pausing sometimes, remembering small details, the way Pedro used to make her laugh, the shared dinners, the plans they once had for their future. But these memories, while bittersweet, no longer weighed her down. They were simply part of her past, a reminder of how far she had come. One afternoon, as Leah sat in a cafe with Camilla, the weight of everything finally hit her. "I never thought I'd get to this point," Leah confessed, sipping her coffee. "For so long, my life revolved around Pedro. What he wanted, what he needed. I didn't think I'd ever know what it felt like to be me again." Camilla smiled warmly, her eyes full of pride for her friend. "I'm so happy for you, Leah. You've been through so much, and you're still standing. You're not just standing, you're thriving. That's something to be proud of." Leah's eyes welled with tears, but this time, they were tears of gratitude. "I never would have done this without you, Camilla. You've always believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself." Camilla reached across the table and squeezed Leah's hand. "That's what friends are for. But don't forget, you found the strength to make these choices. You took the steps. Now you're walking into a future that's entirely yours." Leah smiled through her tears, realizing how true that was. She had reclaimed her life, not just by walking away from her marriage but by rediscovering her passions and dreams. The master's program wasn't just an academic pursuit. It was a symbol of her decision to invest in herself again, to nurture the parts of her that had been forgotten in the shadow of someone else's ambition. In the following weeks, Leah found a small apartment near the university where she would be studying. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was hers. Her space to begin again, moving in felt symbolic. Like she was finally stepping into a life that wasn't dictated by anyone else's expectations but her own. As she unpacked boxes and set up her new home, Leah felt a deep sense of peace. There were still challenges ahead, uncertainties about what her future would look like, how she would handle the pressures of school, and what life would be like without the safety net of her marriage. But these uncertainties didn't scare her anymore. They felt like opportunities, chances to grow and evolve in ways she hadn't allowed herself to consider before. One evening, as Leah was organizing her new bookshelves, she came across an old journal she hadn't touched in years. Curious, she opened it and began flipping through the pages. The entries were from the early days of her marriage to Pedro, filled with hopes, dreams, and plans for their life together. Reading them now, Leah felt a wave of nostalgia, but also a profound sense of distance. The woman who had written those words was no longer who she was. She had grown, changed, and become someone stronger, more independent. Leah smiled softly to herself and closed the journal, placing it back on the shelf. It wasn't something she needed to hold on to anymore. She had written a new story for herself, one that didn't rely on anyone else for validation or fulfillment. The next day, Leah started her first class, walking onto campus with her books in hand. She felt a surge of excitement. This was the beginning of a new chapter, one where she was the main character. The campus buzzed with energy, and as she sat in her first lecture, Leah felt at home. Here, in this space of learning and growth, she was free to explore her own potential. As the weeks turned into months, Leah found herself thriving in ways she hadn't expected. She made new friends, immersed herself in her studies, and even began considering what her career would look like once she completed the program. Teaching had always been her passion, but now, Leah started dreaming of bigger things, creating new educational programs, advocating for reform, perhaps even starting her own initiative one day. One afternoon, while preparing for an upcoming exam, Leah sat in her favorite cafe near the university. The sunlight streamed through the window, and for the first time in what felt like years, she wasn't weighed down by the past. She was fully present, fully engaged in the life she had built for herself. As she looked out at the bustling city around her, Leah allowed herself a quiet moment of reflection. Everything she had been through, the heartbreak, the struggles, the decisions, had led her here, and now, she was finally at peace with where she was. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Leah wasn't afraid of it. She was excited, because now, she knew that whatever came next, she had the strength to face it on her own terms. Months passed, and Leah's life began to take on a new shape, one that was uniquely hers. Her days were filled with the excitement and challenges of her master's program, and she threw herself into her studies with a passion she hadn't felt in years. The university became her second home, a place where she could fully immerse herself in her work and explore the depths of her potential. She thrived in this environment, discovering that she was capable of more than she had ever given herself credit for. Her professors noticed her dedication and began encouraging her to think beyond her studies. They saw leadership potential in her, and for the first time, Leah began to entertain the idea of taking her passion for education further. She could start her own initiatives, develop new programs that would help children learn in innovative ways, or even advocate for educational reform. These weren't just distant dreams, they were now within reach. One evening, after a long day of classes, Leah sat at her desk in her new apartment, reflecting on how much had changed. The small space was now filled with books, research papers, and reminders of the life she was building for herself. It felt like home, truly hers. There were no shadows of the past here, no lingering doubts or regrets about the decisions she had made. As she sat back in her chair, sipping tea and looking over her coursework, Leah thought about how far she had come. The pain of her separation from Pedro had once felt insurmountable, but now it was just a chapter in her story, one that had shaped her but did not define her. She had grieved, she had healed, and now she was growing into the woman she had always been meant to be. Camilla had been right all along. Leah had rediscovered her strength, and in doing so, she had found a sense of peace and purpose that she hadn't known was possible. She no longer felt the need to prove herself to anyone, least of all to Pedro. She was living for herself now, and it was the most liberating feeling she had ever experienced. One weekend, as the weather grew warmer, Leah decided to visit a park she used to love when she first moved to Sao Paulo. It was a place she hadn't been to in years, but it held a special meaning for her. A reminder of the hopeful young woman who had come to the city with dreams in her heart. Walking through the park, Leah found a bench under a large tree and sat down, letting the sounds of the city and the laughter of children playing nearby wash over her. She took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face, and smiled. This was what it meant to be free, not just from the past, but from the expectations she had once placed on herself. She had spent so long trying to mold herself to fit into someone else's life, to be the perfect partner, the perfect wife, but now, sitting in the park with no one to answer to but herself, Leah realized that she had finally reclaimed her own life. She had taken back her dreams, her ambitions, and her sense of self, and in doing so, she had found a happiness that wasn't dependent on anyone else. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of pink and orange, Leah pulled out her journal and began to write. She wrote about her journey, about the strength she had found within herself, and about the dreams she still had for the future. There was no doubt in her mind that there were more challenges ahead, but she was ready for them. She was no longer afraid. When she closed her journal and stood up to leave, Leah felt lighter than she had in years. The weight of the past had been lifted, and all that remained was the open road ahead. She didn't know exactly where it would lead, but she knew that, whatever happened, she would be walking it with confidence, grace, and a deep sense of self-worth. As she walked out of the park and into the busy streets of Sao Paulo, Leah felt a quiet thrill of anticipation for the future. She had reclaimed her life, her identity, and her happiness, and now, anything was possible. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel for more stories that explore the power of resilience, growth, and finding your own path in life. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that they, too, can reclaim their future.